Just got the door back there. All right, I'll give you just a moment to turn there. We're going to go ahead and read the passage that we're looking at this morning and then pray for the start of our lesson. So if we look in 1 Kings chapter 4 and starting in verse 1, it says, "Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord. And the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. And Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in thy house? And she said, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house, save a pot of oil. Then he said, Go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, There is not a vessel more, and the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go sell the oil, and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children on the rest. We'll go ahead and pray, and then we'll get started in our lesson this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day that you've given to us. I pray that you would just bless us today. Please give me the words that you would have me to say, and just hath not anything at all except for a pot of oil. And so we can kind of see the mentality that she has of looking on the dark side of things before saying, oh, but also we have this pot of oil. So she's definitely in a glass half empty mentality here. But she does admit that there is this pot of oil in the house, which was something of value at this time. Now, she obviously didn't have enough for it to be valuable enough to be able to sell or to do anything with, but oil was a valuable commodity at this time. So she did have something that the prophet was able to use. So we see here Elisha's questions. What shall I do for thee? So we see that the widow woman had no clear direction here. That she didn't know where the answer to her prayer was going to come from, and so this is why she came to the prophet Elisha. But also, though her faith was small, it was evident that she had some faith in the fact that she came directly to the man of God. The second question, what hast thou in the house? Rather than granting an immediate miracle, like we discussed, Elisha asked the widow woman to take inventory of what she does have, which also is something that would test her faith. We talked about the widow woman needing to have that faith herself and not rely on the relationship that her husband had with God, not rely on the good things maybe that he did or the way that he taught others to follow God themselves. She had to have that faith herself, that God was going to answer this prayer. And so he asked her to take inventory of what she did have. He was requiring the widow to assess what God had already provided her with. And of course her answer shows that at this point she still regarded her pot of oil as nothing in comparison with the debt. And all throughout scriptures, all throughout history of people following God, we know that people have always taken that glass half empty attitude. The disciples who came before Jesus Christ with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, what are they among so many? What is this pot of oil among such a great debt? What is this that you have given me? It's nothing. And that's the way that she looked at it. But again, like we said, Elisha's job at this point was not to grant an immediate miracle, but it was to direct the woman back into the mentality that she needed to have that faith to see God working. So we see Elisha's command. It says in verse 3, then he said, go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And that's the key words there, borrow not a few. So we see that this miracle that God was going to do through Elisha it required an effort from the woman. And again, ourselves, so oftentimes I think that whenever we have a request that we make, we think that that it's God's responsibility to answer our request with nothing that we do ourselves. And yet, you've heard the saying, and I don't fully agree with everything that people use it for, but a part of it is true, that God helps those who help themselves. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that statement because we should be trusting to God for everything and not helping ourselves first. And when that falls through, then God is our second thing. Then God, looking to God is the second thing that we go for. No, we should be looking to God for everything in our lives, but also we should be looking for God to lead us into what we need to do. Because oftentimes God is going to direct and show us where we need to go to answer the requests that we have. And this is what Elisha is requiring of this widow woman. she had to have that spirit of humility. And sometimes, it's easy. We don't like to ask others. But God has put people in our lives for a reason. God has put our church family here for a reason. That if something happens, that those are the people. I know that a lot of times now it's common for government assistance and different things like that, and that's a lot of people that's something that helps them a lot, and so that's in that sense not always a bad thing, but also if we are in a difficult situation, sometimes God has put specific people in your life also to go to and to ask for help. Now, maybe that doesn't help in a long-term situation like housing and things like that, but if there's a specific situation where somebody can be of help, to flip it on the other side too, not that we should have the humility to go to other Christians and ask them, but also as Christians, we should be looking for ways to see, does somebody need my help? God has blessed me in a way that I have more than what I need. Can somebody else use some of this? Can God use me to be a blessing to somebody else? Can God use me to be an answer to somebody's prayer? Are we looking at the blessings that God has given to us in that light? Because just think about what a wonderful thing that is, that God in all His might and power has the ability to answer prayers, no matter how big or how small they may be, and we might be the answer to that prayer. We might be the answer that somebody is looking for. We might be the way that somebody can have an increased faith in God. And so we should be looking for any way that we can to be of that help. And so we see that Elisha here in a time where there wasn't the option for government assistance or for her declaring bankruptcy, and all of these things that now, if somebody's in a really bad financial position, there are options. She didn't have any of that. And so I think that probably in this time, and not to say anything against anybody, obviously I don't know who here we're watching anybody's situation, but I think that in this time, we are spoiled in a sense because we have a lot of options available to us, and so that this widow woman had to have a little bit more faith than what sometimes we make use of now, just because her options were so limited. But that's not to say, of course, that we can't have that same amount of faith if we have a trust in God, if we have that mindset of looking to Him for all of our needs. And that really should be our default setting. But we see that she does as the prophet commands her. It says in verse 5, so she went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. So he had said, of course, in verse 4, I think I skipped over verse 4, when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So we see, of course, that the miracle required an effort, but the miracle also required faith. And we've talked a little bit about that. Though Elisha did not state specifically what was going to happen, the woman needed the faith to realize that her obedience to the man of God would reap a reward. Now, of course, he says that she was to borrow vessels and shut the door upon her and her son and pour out into all of those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. Now, she didn't know how far that oil was going to go. She didn't know if she was supposed to borrow 10 vessels or 20 or 5. She didn't know. The prophet did not specify to her, and so there was that aspect of faith that was required. Although she did not know the specifics, she needed the faith to realize the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, There is not a vessel more. And the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go sell the oil and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children on the rest. So the accomplishment of the miracle was evidenced in the faith that she had. She had the faith to gather more pots than what was required for her current amount of oil. So she didn't look at it and say, well, I only have one container of oil, so I guess I'll go borrow one more and just see where that gets me, and if I need more, then sure, I'll go out and borrow more. That's not what God commanded. She was to go and borrow as many vessels as she could first. And what do we see here? She had taken that mentality, which is a lack of faith, and said, well, I'll start out borrowing one or two, and then if I need more, if I see that this is working out, then I'll go and get a lot more. What would have happened? It says in verse 6, that when she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel, and he said unto her, There is not a vessel more. If she would just have borrowed two vessels, the oil would have stopped after those two vessels. And then where would she have been? She would have been with two vessels of oil and still a pretty big debt. But we can see that she did have that faith because in verse 7, he says, Go sell the oil and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children on the rest. So how do we know that she had this faith? Because not only did she borrow enough vessels to pay her debt, but that there was obviously some left over. Because the prophet knew that she would have enough to live her and her children on the rest. And then she would have a lot of pots to clean oil out of. So all of that leftover residue, well, that must have been a job, but I'm sure she wasn't complaining at the end of the day. So she gathered enough pots not only to pay the debt, but also to live on the rest. And so this is something that I think we can look at and really take into consideration, given the fact that I think most of us go before God in kind of the same attitude that the widow woman did. It's easy to go before God, and believe me, I know that it takes a lot of years of having an attitude of faith to be able to go to God and say, Lord, it's in your hands. Many times, and this is part of the growing process, but many times we do go before God at first worried and saying, Lord, I don't know how this is going to happen. I don't know how you're going to work this out. Bless God, He's going to work things out for His glory, but yet you still have that mentality of not knowing and worry and the stress that can come from that. And that's natural, we're humans, but yet, if we take what God leads us with, if we look into His Word and can find peace, because He gives us stories like this where we can take and apply them to our hearts. If we look at His Word, He's going to lead us. He's going to direct us in the way that we need to go. And that's where faith comes in. Knowing that if we follow the direction of God, He's going to provide over and abundantly than what we even asked for in the first place. What's the verse? Exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think is how He is going to answer our requests. And that's a promise. That's a promise that God has for us, that He is not only going to provide, but He's going to bless. What is the meaning of the word blessing, or what's the connotation of a blessing? A blessing is over and above what we need. And that's what God promises to His children, that we're never going to be in want. And if you are in want, know that God has a blessing around the corner, which is not only going to provide for that, but to give you more than what you asked for. And so we can take the example of this widow woman with her oil, that one pot of oil that she had. And of course, this reflects not only the widow woman of Zarephath, whose of times we look at Scripture and say, well, we just don't see miracles like that anymore. God doesn't work in that way where we just pour and it keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming. Well, also going back to what we were saying before about us being a little bit spoiled, I think that there are so many resources that we have, but also there are a lot of ways that God can use to provide. He can use those same resources to provide for us so that we don't have to look for those in other ways, that He doesn't need to use these things anymore, but He still provides in the same way. And so, God used that miracle in the time of Elijah, in the time of Elisha, in the time of Jesus Christ. Across over 1,000 years that He was able to do the same miracle. So why is He not able to work that same miracle today? Of course He is. And so anytime we have a situation, let's take this example to increase our faith. And that's the thing that we see in a lot of these miracles, that it required faith, not only of the widow woman, but also of Elisha, that God was going to work as He led the man of God. So let's go ahead and pray